Lament for a Nation by George Grant. Originally, this was written in 1965. It's George Grant's best-known work. In a nutshell, Grant thought Canadian nationalism was either dead or dying. Lament is provocative and insightful, but it's also outdated and biased. Let's look at Grant's ideas and compare them to the 21st century Canada. First, Canadian nationalism is a choice between colonial British democracy or continentalism, which is Americanism. This binary theme permeates Lament. Can Canada have an identity independent of these two models? Well, Grant really didn't think so. Second, Grant thought cooperation between Canada and America somehow undermined Canadian autonomy. Third, branch plants destroy Canada's identity. And in this regard, Grant was talking about American branch plants. Fourth, Diefenbaker failed to unite Canada because Canadians had sold their souls to America rather than embracing Canada's British roots. That was Grant's conclusion in any case. Fifth, technology kills national identities. How so? Well, technology harmonizes processes, and harmonization means all nations are basically the same. Finally, conservatism must languish as technology increases. Why? Well, it's because progress is at odds with conservative values, according to Grant. To summarize, technology, American branch plants, integration of American and Canadian economies, these trends would somehow thwart Grant's dream of a colonial British-Canadian democracy. This said, Grant also had some timeless insights. Let's look at those. First of all, media is shallow. It panders to narratives without any critical thinking. Yes, and that's the case today too. Conservatives are weak on campuses. Absolutely. Back in the 70s, a quarter of university professors were conservatives. Those conservatives are either gone or at best hiding. Conservatives struggle in Quebec. Again, this is true. This is a Tory blind spot. You could fix this by getting more Quebecois into cabinet, but that doesn't really happen, however. Both conservatives and liberals are interventionist. Initially conservatives, but later liberals launched nationalistic programs such as CBC, CNR for the railroads, and Hydro Ontario. Interventionism in Canada is bipartisan. So interventionism is a major difference between our American cousins and Canadians. Americans look to business for solutions. Canadians often ask government to solve problems. Liberals are friendlier to Americans. Historically, this has been true. Now, the U.S.-Canadian partnership is driven more by ideology rather than economics. So it's not as clear-cut. Marx wanted to eliminate scarcity through equality. That would stop oppression. To achieve equality, Marxists always end up stealing individual property. So oppression in the form of stealing is required to eliminate oppression in the form of inequality and scarcity. But Marxists say stealing is for a greater good. Now, Grant understood the flaws of Marxism, but Grant said consumerism was bad too, because it displaces conservative values. So Grant was conflicted between consumerism and Marxism. Early liberals were classical liberals. To illustrate, liberal policy of C.D. Howe had four big pillars. First, Canada was part of a greater continental economy. Second, Canada needed capital, lots of capital, mostly from American banks. Thirdly, capitalism was the motor of growth. And finally, corporations basically ran the show. Why is Lament both outdated and biased? Well, to be fair, Canada has changed a lot over the last 50 years. Nevertheless, many of Grant's assumptions were wrong, even back in the 70s. Cooperation between USA and Canada does not undermine Canadian identity. Why not? Well, collaboration is the foundation of any good partnership. Partners need common goals and a healthy debate too. This is a type of creative tension. Grant actually praised Diefenbaker's opposition to Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But guess what? Diefenbaker got it wrong. Diefenbaker was both reckless and incorrect. That is abundantly clear, at least in retrospect. If you're going to pick a fight with a powerful neighbor, you should at least get your facts right. To be blunt, Diefenbaker was a charismatic politician, but a failed leader. He won a majority, but wasted this mandate on micromanagement and infighting. In opposition, he fought to keep the British red ensign rather than adopting the maple leaf as the Canadian flag. This flag debate was metaphoric of Diefenbaker's eventual defeat, even as leader of the Conservative Party. Branch plants are not the demise of Canada. Why not? Well, many countries host branch plants, yet retain political autonomy. There are many examples from Finland to Singapore. Does China or India worry that American branch plants are hijacking their local culture? No, they're just too busy making money with branch plants. This is a question of management, not politics. Grant said universal harmony is incongruent with Canadian Confederation. Either Canada was 100% autonomous or Canada was simply a cog in a bigger wheel. That's another binary idea from Grant. Modern leaders must retain domestic autonomy, yet cooperate with international partners. The world is getting smaller, better informed, and more crowded. We have to work together, and so do leaders. Universalism brings mediocrity, according to Grant. He equated homogenizations with mediocrity, yet he doesn't really have a convincing argument for this position. Grant said the future battle will be between democratic tyrants and the authoritarian right. This is 100% wrong. Nearly all tyrants are on the left. Stalin, Pol Pot, Castro, Mao, they were all leftists. Hitler's National Socialism, with its centralized control and classless society, is also a Marxist model. Canada could have adopted an indigenous culture as an identity. No, every indigenous society in the Americas was eclipsed and replaced by Western civilization. Love it or hate it, Manifest Destiny shaped development of the New World everywhere. Catholicism is incompatible with capitalist goals, but consistent with old world conservatism. Grant actually believed in Max Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. This theory doesn't really work. There are just too many successful Catholics. Grant's ideal society was tied to the church and British. This is a Richard Hooker world of the 16th century. It's 16th century conservatism. This vanished in England centuries ago. Grant said Canada was culturally either English or French. No, Canada is multicultural. The French versus English paradigm was dying even when Grant wrote Lament. European nations are also proof that small nations can keep their identity despite sharing borders with much larger and more powerful neighbors. The Dutch are Dutch, Greeks are Greek, Swiss are Swiss. Small countries can have unique identities. Canada can have a unique identity too. In fact, George H.W. Bush called Canadians kinder and gentler Americans. That is a Canadian identity. Canadian identity can be part of a North American identity and still remain different, the same way Quebecois retain their distinct society, yet remain within Canada. Other trends emerged after Grant penned Lament, such as globalization, big pan-national entities such as G20, UN, NATO, EU. There was an explosion of the service sector, which now employs over 80% of the workforce. Information technology has expanded, and there's a much larger role of women everywhere. Useful reflections for Canada and for conservatives. Well, today's conservatives are actually classical liberals. They want individual rights, freedom of speech, upward mobility, equality of opportunity, smart, effective, small government, fiscal restraint. That's all classical liberalism, the classical liberalism of de Tocqueville, and its self-interest well understood. So conservatives of today have far more in common with C.D. Howe or Mackenzie King, both liberals, than they have with John A. Macdonald or John Diefenbaker. Axiomatically, the Liberal Party of Canada today, or at least the Liberals, are not classical liberals. Rather, liberals are postmodern globalists. They want a global Marxist utopia built on the ruins of Western democracy. Conservatives must win back campuses. They must be more aggressive in urban areas, Quebec, and with women. Yes, conservatives, also known as classical liberals, should be popular, and that should be a populist policy, but it isn't. Why not? Well, conservatives communicate poorly. Grant saw this weakness 50 years ago. Nationalists and conservatives must master social media to sell their vision. They must reach new voters. Why is this critical? It's critical because mainstream media is both unreliable and openly hostile to conservatives. The final red pill. Conservatives tend to be better managers than leaders. But conservatives cannot lead a nation unless they win elections coast to coast. Technology is indeed compatible with conservatism. You build on the past while welcoming progress. John Stuart Mill called this utilitarianism. It's just common sense. Values don't change, but technology evolves. When in doubt, you ask people what they want. Grant said the role of science had changed, and it was no longer just overcoming nature. Science had become a goal in itself. Grant feared science would lead us into darker forms of society. Yes, this is a risk. We need to reconcile technology with societal needs. To conclude, the biggest threat to Canada is not Americanism or consumerism or science. Rather, Canada's biggest risk today is postmodernism. That is replacing Western democracy with global Marxism, managed by unelected ideologues. All in all, Lament is provocative. It makes Canadians reflect. What is the Canadian identity? What do Canadians want going forward? The future will be neither British, nor American, nor globalist. It will be Canadian. Thank you.